Good evening. Those in the back, if you can't hear me, just let me know, just if I start fading away. Thank you for coming tonight. I think we just dodged a really good weather bullet tonight, so it turned out pretty well. Many years ago, I became fascinated not just with the architecture and the history of New York City, but also with the incidental stories that very often attach themselves to these buildings and monuments and other locations. When we talk about architecture and history, most often we're discussing the great military leaders or the powerful politicians, the master architects and sculptors that shaped the city. But we very rarely talk about those, again, incidental stories that bring all of these locations to a more human proportion. And so for all of those of you who are looking at me and saying, I have no idea what you're talking about, we'll do one example. St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue, one of the most masterful examples of Gothic revival architecture, certainly in the country, if not in the world. So when students of architecture and history and art study St. Patrick's, they learn about the genius architect, James Renwick Jr., and they learn about Archbishop John Hughes, who had the foresight to build the cathedral so far north of the established city that Fifth Avenue wasn't even paved at this point. And they learn about events like the Civil War that brought construction to a halt for so many years. But they never hear about John Matthews. So John Matthews came to New York in 1836, and he brought with him the understanding of how to make soda water. And for those of you who are fuzzy on that, it's created when you introduce acid to calcium, you trap the resultant carbon dioxide gases, interject those into the water and make those tasty little bubbles. That's a very simplified recipe, so don't try it at home tonight. It won't work. So John Matthews would walk by the construction site of St. Patrick's Cathedral, and he saw these piles of marble chips that were deposited there by the masons and the stone cutters. And he realized two things. Someone was going to have to clean up all that debris, and marble is calcium. So he made what seemed to be a very generous offer. He said he would be glad to keep, clearing off the site. And over the decades that it took to complete St. Patrick's, he took away enough marble to produce 25 million gallons of soda water. He became known as the Soda Water King. He amassed a sizable personal fortune. And his is one of those incidental stories of the building of St. Patrick's that you'll never hear about, but which I find absolutely fascinating. So that's your example. Now we'll talk about me some more. About 6 years ago, an architect friend of mine was in town. His name's Paul Aniter, and he was here on business, and we arranged to have lunch that day. So we were walking between 6th and 5th Avenue on West 54th Street, and if you know that block, you know that the north side of it is lined with essentially intact mansions from the turn of the last century. And as we were walking along, I was pointing out the Philip Lehman House and the Rockefeller House and the Dr. Moses Starr House. And I was just gushing on about the stories that I always do. And he said, "You've got to write a blog." Excuse me. Well, I didn't know what a blog was, so I ignored him. But after about 3 months of being badgered, I finally did start a blog. And today I've written about more than 1,650 Manhattan locations, believe it or not. And that became the basis of the book. So we had to pick 50 out of 1,650. And we'll talk about a few of those tonight. And as you heard, I tried to pick out a few of the taller buildings in the book, but we're going to be talking about Skyscraper in the definition that they used in 1901 and not in 2015. And you can't talk about a New York skyscraper without talking about this building. And if you think that's the Flatiron Building, you're about 3/4 of the way right. It's actually the Fuller Building. It got the nickname the Flatiron Building, and it stuck. And the peculiar wedge shape of that building started when, in 1811, the commissioners released the commissioner's plan, which laid out the streets and avenues in what is now Midtown, actually just above, I guess, around 11th Street, and all those beautiful little perfect rectangles. But the problem was that for more than a century, Broadway had run diagonally down the island. It entered in the northwest corner as Bloomingdale Road, became Broadway, and ended up all the way at the tip of the island. But it went diagonally, and that resulted in a series of bow tie-shaped intersections all the way up Broadway. And this is one of them at 23rd Street, at Fifth Avenue, and Broadway. Now, in 1902, Harry S. Black got interested in this funny shape of piece of land. At the time, it was filled with a mishmash of 2- and 3-story buildings. But by 1902, it was extremely valuable property. 23rd Street was lined with grand emporiums and business buildings, as was Broadway and, of course, Fifth Avenue. On the northwest corner, on the diagonal was the very fashionable Fifth Avenue Hotel, and on the opposite was Madison Square. Well, Harry S. Black was the principal of the Fuller Construction Company, and Fuller Construction was not only the first general contracting firm, they also specialized in the construction of skyscrapers. So what Harry S. Black wanted to do was not only create an impressive new headquarters for his company, he wanted to do this as a marketing ploy, an advertisement of what the Fuller Building could do. So he commissioned Chicago architect Daniel Burnham to design this Renaissance-inspired building. All those, by the way, all the wonderful ornamentation that you really can't see too well in this photograph was not done by Burnham. It was done by one of the Fuller designers who had the unfortunate name of Frederick Dinkelberg. But as soon as construction began, it earned the nickname of a Flatiron Building. That was not an exclusive term. Every triangular-shaped building at the turn of the century was called a Flatiron Building. This one just happened to catch on. And we know where the Flatiron name came from. If you don't, that's a flat iron. At the turn of the century, housewives and Irish servant girls and like would have 3 or 4 of these at a time sitting on a wood-burning stove to keep one hot all the time, and that's how they ironed their clothes. So because it was cast iron, it became known as a flat iron, and the cast iron also gave us the term ironing. So anyway, it was that triangular shape that gave us the beautiful Flatiron Building. Now, at the turn of the century, in 1902, by the way, construction started in March 1902. It was completed within 9 months at whirlwind rate. So New Yorkers and the nationwide, but New Yorkers in particular, were very concerned about the height of building at the time. They weren't so concerned about how high a building could go, but how high a building should go. They were concerned about the sunlight being blocked from the streets. They were concerned about what was going to happen if a fire broke out above the ladder line of the fire trucks. But that wasn't really the case with the Flatiron Building. People nationwide, and mostly in New York, were concerned with the shape of the Flatiron Building. By 1903, New Yorkers were absolutely positively convinced that this building was causing wind storms. It was felt that because 23rd Street was an avenue-wide street, and there were the 2 avenues that went on either side, and the wide-open Madison Square, that all of this air and drafts was being picked up and separated by that wedge and causing horrible, horrible windstorms. The New York Times in 1903 reported that wind gusts around the Flatiron Building reached 1,000 miles an hour. I think we can all agree that that was a bit of hyperbole. But the same year, they also reported on a 14-year-old boy named James McTaggart. He was a messenger boy, and in 1903, if you owned a business or worked in an office, and you needed to get a message to your lawyer or your bank or a resource, you didn't pick up the telephone because most people didn't have one, and you didn't send a fax or you didn't send an email. You wrote your message out on a piece of paper, folded it in half, and gave it to your messenger boy. The streets were full of these kids running all over the place. Well, that's what Jimmy McTaggart was doing that morning. And according to the New York Times, he tried 3 times to round the corner at 23rd Street. And 3 times he was blown back. And finally, very resolutely, he pushed his way onto 23rd Street. The wind picked him up into the air, dropped him into Fifth Avenue, where he was fatally hit by a vehicle. Now, the fact that Jimmy McTaggart died that day is irrefutable, but the circumstances, I think, are probably a little more questionable. But nevertheless, it was a real problem, a real perceived problem to New Yorkers. There was a merchant on Fifth Avenue across the street who sued the Fuller Company in 1903 because their winds blew out one of his plate glass windows. And another newspaper said that no vehicle could pass the Flatiron Building that was lighter than an omnibus without it being blown over. Now, the only people who didn't really care about this were the young men who used to hang out at the point of the Flatiron Building because they were hoping that all those winds they heard about would pick up the hem of a lady's dress and they could see a little glimpse of ankle. And that became a problem, so policemen routinely made the rounds in front of the Flatiron Building to move these guys away. And that's where we got the term, which has now pretty much died off, but in the 20s and 30s it was very popular, 23 skidoo. Eventually, Harry S. Black, I might add that the people nationwide wrote in with their suggestions on how to fix the wind problem caused by this building. Most all of them said tear it down. There was one engineer from New England who suggested putting 4-foot stone balconies every other floor at different locations, and that would break up the wind and that would solve the problem. But Harry S. Black and the Fuller Company in general just pretty much ignored it. And in 1905, they actually added the 21st floor. That was their answer. And it was on the 21st floor in 1909 that the Fuller Building actually had its major structural test. It had always been marketed as a totally fireproof structure. In 1909, fire broke out on the top floor. A fireman had to haul hoses all the way up 21 floors of staircase, and they fought that fire for 5 hours before putting it out. And as it turns out, the Fuller Building did turn out to be essentially fireproof. The fire was caused by items and merchandise inside the building, but not the building. And it really came out structurally intact. The only problem was that the heat dislodged a 4-foot piece of masonry that fell 21 floors to the sidewalk on Fifth Avenue, barely missing by inches a policeman. And the impact, the concussion of that piece of masonry was so large, was so great, that it blew out plate glass windows on the other side of Fifth Avenue, which just shows you between 1902 and 1910, you didn't want to have a plate glass window opposite the Flatiron Building. So eventually all the hoopla about winds and the Flatiron Building went away. Today it's one of the most beloved buildings in Manhattan. It's probably one of the 3 most iconic New York buildings alongside the Empire State and the Chrysler Building. New Yorkers look at that as much a piece of sculpture as they do architecture. In 1926, the migration of the movie industry had pretty much completed from New York to Hollywood. In the turn of the century in 1910, New York was the center of the silent movie industry. But Hollywood's climate and lack of winter and such made it just much more logical to move. But in 1926, Adolf Zukor decided it was time for a new headquarters for Paramount Pictures. And rather than build it in California, he picked the center of the entertainment industry in America, Broadway in Times Square. He commissioned the architectural firm of Rapp and Rapp, who probably no one's heard of. They had produced a few silent movie theaters in the Midwest, but now they came to New York with this major commission. The building is 33 stories tall, Art Deco, and I should have actually brought, just to remind you, what the Paramount logo looks like. It's the mountains with the circle of stars. So Rapp and Rapp, on the very top, they simulated a mountain, and then instead of stars on the 4 clocks, they put stars. Instead of numbers on the 4 clocks, they put stars. And that was sort of a nod to the Paramount logo. On top of the 33rd story is an illuminated globe. That globe could be seen as far away as New Jersey. This was the tallest building on Broadway north of the Woolworth Building. It was an impressive, monumental building, but the real showstopper was the Paramount Theater. You entered it on Broadway under that magnificent marquee, and behind the marquee was a 4-story arch that included the word Paramount spelled out in electric lights. The interior of the theater was modeled after the Paris Opera. The auditorium was 4 stories tall. There was a massive Art Deco chandelier there. Years before Radio City would open, the orchestra pit here would raise and lower on a hydraulic lift. Those curtains were 2 stories tall. They were red velvet. And there was a massive Wurlitzer organ here, but these were silent movies. They had to have some kind of a background. There was a massive Wurlitzer organ. They called it the Dowager Empress. It had 33 tons of organ pipes. So this is where the Paramount Pictures premieres were done. They weren't done in Hollywood. They were done in New York City on Broadway. This is where stars like Mae West and Claudette Colbert and William Powell would walk the red carpet. The first week that this theater was open in 1926, it took in $800,000 in ticket sales. And that was possible because this auditorium sat 3,664 people. It was a massive silent movie theater. Unfortunately, it opened in 1926, and 2 years later, we had the Great Depression. And with the Great Depression, going to the movies became an avoidable expense. So it wasn't long before the Paramount Theater was barely making it, if at all. So the management decided to follow the lead of Radio City and offer not only silent movies, but live entertainment. And while Radio City had the Rockettes, Paramount Theater had the big bands. Throughout the jazz period, the swing era of the 1930s, every big band in America, Xavier Cugat, Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey, they all played here. All of the great entertainment groups that everyone wanted to see, like the Andrews Sisters, they were here. And as the years went by, Frank Sinatra, Jack Benny, Jerry Lewis, and Dean Martin, they all wanted to play at the Paramount. Excuse me. During World War II, during the blackout, In 1944, the government ordered that the clock and the globe be painted black. And believe it or not, they remained painted black until 1994. As the 1950s came along, Alan Freed used the Paramount to highlight his new talent like Buddy Holly. And it was here that Elvis Presley's first movie, Love Me Tender, premiered. On that night, there was a 40-foot cutout of Elvis Presley on the marquee outside. Broadway had to be closed down because Times Square was infiltrated by thousands of screaming high school girls. Then another change came, and that was television. By the 1960s, people were spending more time in front of their television sets than they were going to the movies. So in 1964, following the last screening of The Carpetbaggers, the Paramount Theater was closed for good. The giant chandelier was sold, the Wurlitzer organ was shipped off to Kansas City, and the 4-story auditorium was floored over and turned into offices. Even the marquee was scrapped, and that 4-story archway out front was removed and just became part of the facade. And that would be the end of the story until the year 2000, when a most unlikely company came along, the World Wrestling Federation, and rented a little more than 1,400 square feet of street-level space for a restaurant and store. And for some reason, they decided that they would go back to old photographs and they would recreate the old Paramount arch right down to the sign with the light bulbs and the marquee. We don't know why they did that, but we're really, really happy they did. They didn't last very long either. After they spent all that money, they were gone. I think it's a Hard Rock Cafe today.
Where is this? What's the cross street?
Broadway and 40, yeah. So, yeah, 1501 Broadway. Yeah, so we can thank the WWF for bringing back a wonderful piece of New York, and unfortunately, the auditorium is gone for good.
There's a theater downstairs.
Is there? Not 3,664. In 1901, the year before Harry Black started on his Flatiron Building, Joseph Ashe started on his building on Waverly Place. Waverly Place, 2 blocks away from Washington Square, half a century before, even 25 years before this, was filled with magnificent brick and brownstone mansions of some of New York's wealthiest people. John Jacob Astor lived about a block away, for instance. But by the turn of the century, the millinery and apparel district, which was forever marching northward, had taken over this entire area. And all of those mansions came down one by one to be replaced by loft buildings. Joseph Ashe was a furrier, and so he commissioned the Chicago architect of John Woolley. Actually, I said Chicago. He wasn't Chicago. He's a very little-known architect, to design this 10-story loft building. And Ashe intended not only to have this for his headquarters and the factory for his fur-making company, but to lease out to other apparel firms. And one of the firms that took it, you're probably all very familiar with it, was the Triangle Waist Company. In 1901, the shirtwaist, or the waist as it was sometimes called, was the most popular women's garment in all of America. It was worn in different variations from shop girls to socialites, and there were hundreds of thousands of these made constantly, mostly in New York City. So the Triangle Waist Company made only one garment, and that was the waist. And they took 3 floors, the 10th, 9th, and 8th floors of the Ashe building. The offices were on the top floor, and the 9th and 8th floors were factory space. Now, it was not a pleasant place to work. To get a job at the Triangle, you had to supply your own thread and your own needles. And in 1909, there was a women's garment strike in New York City. None of the Triangle girls were unionized, but management got wind of the fact that some of these girls who worked here were sympathetic with the strikers. So 150 of those girls were fired for being sympathetic. And after that, the two guys who ran the two floors, who supervised the two floors, Max Blank and Isaac Fletcher, of what they considered bad behavior or violations in the workplace. Women after that point were not allowed to lift their eyes up from their sewing machines. They were forbidden to speak. If they went to the restroom, they were highly monitored. When they left at night, they were searched. And again, after 1909, these two men went so far as to close the iron shutters to the courtyard windows. The turn of the century, every loft building, every apartment building of any size was required to have a central shaft for ventilation and light. Well, these men closed those iron shutters and they locked the girls in as they worked. Well, on March 25th, 1911, Mary Herman left her house to come to work at the Triangle. It was a Saturday morning, and women who worked at places like Triangle or any of the other factories worked 6 days a week. So about 4:45 that afternoon, everyone was sort of mentally preparing to leave. The day was over at 5 o'clock. And it was about this time on the 8th floor, one floor below where Mary worked, that a small fire broke out in a pile of fabric. And before it was noticed, it had spread to a string of paper patterns that was hanging over the pattern tables. And then it just was out of control. So one of the women on the 8th floor telephoned the 10th floor offices to tell them the building was on fire, get out. And in all the confusion and panic, everyone forgot to call the 8th floor, or the 9th floor, I'm sorry. I'm sure that most everyone thought somebody had. So the girls on Mary Herman's floor just finished their work. It was March, so they went to the coat closets and got their wraps. Then they visited the paymaster, and he gave them their envelopes for the week. And then the fire and the smoke hit the 9th floor. There was obviously panic. Someone saw Mary Herman run to one of the doors and wrestle with it, but it was locked. She couldn't get out. One of the girls managed to pry open those iron shutters and get out onto a fire escape in the courtyard. And of course, scores of girls followed her. And as they rushed down, they were terrified when they reached the lowest level, only to find out that no one had ever installed the drop ladder. So they were stuck on the fire escape. In the meantime, up on the 9th floor, the fire spread to a barrel of machinery oil that was used for the sewing machines. Well, that, of course, exploded, and the fire was just unescapable. The only thing the women could do was jump. When the fire department got there a few minutes later, they had a very difficult time pulling up to the ash building because of what they termed the rain of bodies. And the sidewalks were just littered with bodies. I chose not to bring some of those photographs, but this is what Mary Herman's floor looked like right afterwards. The women who were on that fire escape, as they kept cramming and cramming and cramming on, the weight became such that the fire escape, of course, just collapsed, and they fell to the pavement in the light well. Mary Herman didn't come home that day, and neither did 149 of her co-workers. The entire nation was horrified at this story. And the one positive thing about the Triangle Fire was that it resulted in enhanced fire codes for building construction, and it certainly resulted in increased labor laws, or favorable labor laws. To Joseph Ashe's credit, his building, too, was really not structurally damaged. It was damaged badly, but it was not structurally damaged. He had it rebuilt, and he made sure that it was built to far exceed the new fire codes. He never wanted anything like this to happen again. Joseph Ashe got $200,000 from his insurance company. Max Blank and Isaac Fletcher were taken to court to answer for the deaths of 150 young girls, young women. And believe it or not, they were sent home scot-free because the jury said there was no proof. They knew those doors were locked. The families who lost a loved one that day got $75. 14 of the girls were so badly burned that they were never, ever identified. And finally, the mayor of New York simply decided to bury them together at the city's expense. And on that day, 8,000 garment workers walked off the job so they could march up Fifth Avenue in that funeral procession. Today, the Ashe Building is known as the Brown Building. It's owned by New York University. Actually, right after Ashe began rebuilding right after he finished rebuilding the Ashe Building, NYU started leasing offices and then floors. And eventually the building was purchased and donated to the university. Today, every March 25th, the New York City Fire Department holds a memorial service out front in memory of those 150 girls, and they ring that big silver fire bell we've all seen 150 times. This building stands at 57 West 57th Street. It was built between 1926 and 7 and designed by Warren and Wetmore. It's a magnificent Art Deco building. It's all in the details. You really can't see it in this picture, but there are marvelous Art Deco entrances and grill work and such. The concept for this building, which was called the Medical Arts Building, was very groundbreaking. This entire building, it's 18 stories tall, and 16 of those stories were meant for medical offices, dental offices, anything related to the medical industry. There were even private sanitariums here. Dr. Browning, for instance, took the 14th floor. He called it Dr. Browning Sanitarium, and it was sort of like a private little hospital where you could go to avoid publicity and things like that. When he opened his sanitarium in 1926, he proudly advertised that every room had a radio. Warren and Wetmore decorated with all sorts of medical motifs. You can see here there's a line of portraits of important medical men throughout the centuries. But the real drama of the Medical Arts Building started a couple years before it was even started, before construction was started. There was a man at the time, he was a retired bicycle racer. Racist. He just hated those bicycles. He was a bicycle racer. His name was Albert Champion, and we probably would not remember Albert Champion at all today were it not for one invention, and that was the spark plug. And all of you people sitting there think that the Champion spark plug was named because of its performance. Well, that's not true. It was named after Albert Champion. The spark plug garnered Mr. Champion a massive fortune. And in the early 20s, he came to New York on business. And he caught the eye of a young girl. She was about half his age. And her name was Edna Crawford. She was what in the 1920s was termed a gold digger. Well, she got her hooks into Albert Champion, all right. He went back to Chicago, gave his wife $1 million and a divorce. And he came back to New York to be with Edna. Well, it wasn't long after that things began to be a little dark. Albert lavished Edna with furs and jewels and expensive gifts, but he refused to give her one dime of her own money. He was extremely jealous of this younger woman, and he kept her on a very short leash, so to speak. In 1927, the two of them were in Paris, and Edna ran into a very dashing man named Charles Rizzoli. Rizzoli was to Edna what Edna had been to Albert. He was looking for a wealthy woman, even though, by the way, he was married. So Albert Champion walked into a bistro one night, and there he found Edna with Charles. There was a very unpleasant confrontation during which Charles slugged Albert in the side of the head with his fist, and Albert died about 2 hours later. Edna and Charles were able to convince the authorities that Albert had a heart condition. There was never an investigation, and Edna came home to New York with $12 million more than she'd left with, and a married boyfriend. Now, when they got back, this building was completed. And I mentioned that only up to the 16th floor were medical offices. The 17th and the 18th floor of this building had been built as penthouse apartments, floor-through penthouses. And this was a new deal with wealthy people living. At the turn of the century, the top floors of a house or even an apartment building is where all the servants lived. Servants had to climb the stairs. Servants had to live under those very often hot roofs. But by the time that skyscraper living came along, these wealthy New Yorkers, or these wealthy residents anyway, realized that the best views were from the top. The best ventilation, there was no air conditioning back then, was at the top. And there was room for outdoor space, balconies and terraces. So actually it all started pretty much with 1040 Park Avenue. But by now, by the time this building opened up, penthouse living was the epitome of wealthy living. So Charles Rizzoli somehow or other saw these two apartments, and he determined that he wanted to live there. The problem was that the management of the Medical Arts Building refused to rent those apartments to Edna or to Charles. And probably in 1927, that was because of their living arrangements. So Edna had a solution. She took out her checkbook, she wrote a check for $1.3 million, bought the building, and now they could live there. She put Charles in charge of running the building. He had an office, and he collected the rents, and he arranged the leases and such. And in the meantime, Edna went to work renovating and decorating the two top floors. It took her several years to finish this project, and one of the things she did was to install an interior staircase, a secret staircase, so she and Charles could run up and down. Her tastes apparently were a little over the top, at least by today's standards. She had a multi-tiered interior fountain in one of her rooms. The canopy over her four-poster bed was constructed of $30,000 worth of antique Russian bishop's vestments. And she had a 40-foot mural installed on one wall in one room that depicted herself and Charles as the main characters in a Venetian festival scene. And Edna was stark naked, other than a festival mask and a pair of high heels. Well, as had been the case with Edna and Albert, the relationship between Charles and Albert kind of went south pretty fast. He became extremely domineering. He hired a staff of French servants who spied on Edna and reported back. And eventually, he essentially kept her prisoner on that 18th floor. They would have loud, violent, physical, drunken fights. And in one instance, he picked up a telephone, and remember, this is the 1920s, so it's those heavy candlestick phones, you know. He picked up a telephone and flung it at her, hitting her in the head. Well, Edna's family found out about this, and they ousted Charles from the building. And then they hired two big burly bodyguards to stand watch on the 18th floor to protect Edna. But the thing was that Charles, because he had managed the building, had a key to every single room in this building. So he was able to hide out for weeks at a time simply by changing whichever, and there were tons of beds. There were beds all over the place because it was a medical building. So the last time that Charles tried to get onto the 18th floor, he was discovered by Edna's bodyguards, and reportedly he was tossed out a window onto the 17th floor terrace, his terrace, one floor below. Now, coincidentally or not, Edna died that same night. Charles lived on until 1935, when he died of heart disease. And we would all say, well, that was the end of a very, very peculiar story, but it's not the end. Those 2 floors sat empty for several years. And then a radio and film producer, whose name was Carlton Alsop, had just gotten married. So he took those 2 apartments, he had them converted into one gigantic, lavish duplex penthouse. And the couple moved in. They had a couple big dogs. I think they were like Russian wolfhounds. And immediately things became rather eerie. The dogs would sit and stare at a corner or a staircase or a blank wall and just shiver and whine as if something was going on. And Mrs. Alsop complained that she was always hearing high heels going up and down the staircases. And when her husband wasn't home, she would hear people arguing in other rooms, and she'd go and look, and of course there was no one there. Finally, she not only left that apartment, she left her husband. So Carlton Alsop stayed here for a couple years. He would give lavish cocktail and dinner parties for the likes of Judy Garland and people like that. But he was always being told that there was something very wrong with this apartment. People would say as they went up the staircase, someone would tug on their garments, but when they turned, there was no one there. Or someone would whisper in their ear, but there was no one there. And finally, he told his agent, get rid of the apartment, I don't care at what loss. So today, the 17th and 18th floors of the Medical Arts Building are an art gallery. And as far as I know, there's no more disembodied high heels or people arguing in the shadows. But this building is very, very popular with paranormal enthusiasts. They love this building. And it is, without a doubt, one of the most bizarre tales of a Midtown skyscraper. And I think that's about all the time we have, and I certainly thank you for your attention. Yeah. Do we have any questions? I covered it that well? Why? And don't ask me what my favorite building in New York is.
Can I ask you about a mystery building, a building I've wondered about? I stumbled across a building on 35th Street between 5th Avenue and Madison. Quite tall. At the top, I just happened to notice a row of what looked like ram's heads. Across the top.
Yeah, I know that building.
What's the story there?
I don't know.
Okay.
Actually, I have tried to research that building. I have found very, very little on it, but it is a stunning building. Yeah. Actually, this woman here in the black, this is Alice Lump. She was the photographer for this book, or it's not there, but the book. And Alice actually took pictures of that and sent them to me one day, and she said, oh, look at this building. And I had already found it myself too. But that's the kind of building it is. I mean, you'll walk down the street and that building you'll catch. But I can't help you. Yes, ma'am.
Is this building landmarked?
Which one?
This one.
I don't believe it is. Do you know?
I'm not sure, no.
I don't believe it is.
Is it still used for medical?
Yes, it is still medical offices after 80, 90 years. Yeah.
The Paramount.
57 West 57.
The Paramount is landmarked, and I assume that's why there was a rigorous...
That may be. It could be. If you're going to do something, you better do this. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure you're right.
So is the 17th and 18th floors still apartments?
No, they're art gallery.
Art gallery.
A single art gallery, yeah.
Thank you.
So I have a weird question, so I don't mean to stump you, but in old photographs of City Hall looking south, it looks like there's a very tall building that right abuts the old City Hall Park, and it's not there anymore. Just wondering if you happen to know what that was.
Post office.
Yeah, it could be, although that wasn't all that tall. That was pretty squat.
Wasn't the Singer Building, was it?
Oh, yeah, it probably was the old Singer Building, yes. Wasn't? You wouldn't see it from there?
Is she thinking of the old St. Paul building?
Yeah, there's so many that have been lost down there.
On the north end of City Hall or the south end?
South end more looked like sort of east of the Woolworth Building.
That's what the,
St. Paul,
That's
probably
by
the
the
St.
St. Paul
St. Paul
building,
building
yeah.
by George B. Post. It's a slender tower with lots of horizontal layering and
Yeah, maybe
Classical
dome
columns.
Dome top, I think.
yeah.
probably. Because it was one of the tallest buildings in the city. About 1900.
Yeah, I mean, there's been so many that have been lost. You'd almost have to see it. Yes, ma'am.
Obviously, I would guess that obviously that waste factory fire is what was the famous New York garment workers fire, which I always thought was like on Hester Street or something.
Oh, no, no, no. Yeah. Yeah, most people are very surprised at when they stumble across the brown building now, the ash building, because I think everyone almost knows that story. But I think people are a little fuzzy about where it was, and you don't think about Waverly Place being the garment district, which it was at that time.
Waverly Place and
Some
Broadway.
color green and
Yes. Yeah, yeah, sir.
Do you have a building that's been just an absolute conundrum that you haven't been able to, I mean, you said you started looking at the one that you mentioned, but are there any others that have you haven't been able to really?
It doesn't happen too often because luckily we have pretty good, for New York. I mean New York, not for New York. New York has pretty good records that you can find. I mean, even the real estate record and guide goes back to the 1860s. So, yeah, there are sometimes. There's a marvelous mansion on West End Avenue that I had taken pictures of some months ago, and I ran home and started researching it, and I'm telling you, I could not find anything on it. And I was talking about it. Actually, I took a friend of mine who works for Landmarks West, and I took him to it, and I said, okay, this building just disappears off. It's just like it's the Twilight Zone there. So he helped me. We worked together on that, and that now I've got my start. So I'm gonna. Yes, sir.
Have you been to the art gallery? Are there any remnants of what the apartment might have
I have not been there, and I would imagine an art gallery being an art gallery, they probably stripped it. I know that, interestingly enough, when Carlton Alsop redid it and reconfigured it into a single duplex mega penthouse, he kept that 40-foot mural. That's the only thing he kept. Everything else went, but he kept that mural. Yep.
Does your blog still exist?
Yes, it does.
Oh, okay.
There's a new building every single day. Wow. Except for Sunday. That's my day of rest. It's not because I'm religious, it's because I need a rest.
Is your book in the shop there?
It is.
And the URL for your blog is?
Oh dear. I'll give you a card. It's way too hard to say. Yeah, that's the name. Actually, if you just Google that, Daytonian in Manhattan, you'll find it.
What are your sources that you get your information from?
We were talking just before. I have a pretty significant personal library of vintage guidebooks and such like that. So that's one of my sources. I have guidebooks that go back to 1866, I believe. So that's a lot of fun, just going through there. The problem with those is you have to be so darn careful when you're like, you can't just, go through. Then online, you can get the real estate record and guide, you can get the New York Times archives, you can get the Library of Congress has newspaper archives going back to 1836, I think. So there's a lot of places like that. Then I also love to go into the records of divorces and things like that, because you get all kinds of dirt there.
The real estate recording guide, is that
It's online.
publication?
It's a publication. It was a publication for real estate developers and owners and such. It started around the Civil War. And do you know when it's ended?
Darren, I'm not.
I thought it goes like until the 1960s.
Yeah,
But they've only got till 1922 online.
in Columbia.
Yeah.
Does it cover the whole city?
It actually no, it's the whole city, and actually they have sections for other cities as well.
It doesn't really have, or it only has a few articles, it's mostly a record.
Yeah, it's mostly a record.
Sales, construction.
Right. It'll tell you, for instance, that this person bought this plot of land and he has hired this architect who has just filed plans for this building. And it'll give you a very brief description of what that building's going to look like and what it cost. And it'll give you the dimensions and things like that. So.
There are a few narrative articles and illustrated, but it's not like, Harper's Weekly or something.
Right.
I don't know if you fully explained how you got interested in this whole thing and what's your background in history or architecture.
No, actually not, believe it or not. Oh, I don't believe it or not. I can almost tell you the exact moment that it occurred to me. I mean, I don't know when I got interested in architecture and history. I can't even tell you, but it was very early. I mean, very early, But when I was about 12 years old in Dayton, Ohio, the government was planning State Route 35 through Dayton, Ohio. And that swath of land that they took by eminent domain included blocks and blocks and blocks and blocks, as you can imagine, it was a highway, of 1880s through maybe World War I homes. And they were, looking back, they were marvelous, mostly like Queen Anne, and they were just wonderful houses. So this friend of mine decided we would go exploring these houses. We were 12-year-old boys. What do you do? Right? And the houses were open. We weren't breaking in. They were going to bulldoze them. So we went through these houses one afternoon, and because these houses were going to be torn down, it wasn't like someone else was going to move in. So people who didn't want that thing just left it there. So as we went through the houses, there were books and letters and, in some case, clothes and stuff like that. And I remember distinctly, when I was like in a bedroom or something, thinking that this wasn't just a building, this is someone's house. There were stories in this house. I mean, I was only a kid, but that's pretty deep, But I remember thinking that, and that is really what got me to look at buildings differently than most people do. I see the stories, that happen in those buildings. I remember went to my grandfather's house. We would go there for Christmas, on Christmas Eve. And his house was, I guess, probably 1900. It was a one-story little house. But I remember as a little kid sitting there on a Christmas Eve and wondering what Christmases used to look like in that house. So I was a really weird little child. And it just followed me. Anyone else? Oh, yes.
What do you know about the unfinished decoration on the top of the Metropolitan?
That is a wonderful, wonderful thing. While Richard Hunt was doing the new face for the Metropolitan, no, when they went from the old brick to the new Beaux-Arts, those huge, they look like Egyptian blocks up there on those cornices. Those were all, the drawings for those sculptural groups exist. You can go online probably and find them. But what happened is the financial panic came and there was no money. They just ran out of money. So they never finished that part of the museum. And then for some reason, when there was money, no one just ever did it. And now those unfinished blocks, which most people don't even notice, it's one of my favorite things to do, is to point out those unfinished blocks. They've just become part of the history of the facade. You know, I kind of wish they would have done it, but I kind of like them like they are.
Alcoves, you know, the arched alcoves that are empty, was there something intended to be in them?
Oh yeah, there would have been a statuary in there too. Yeah, yeah. They will never carve those.
Oh, excuse me, where are those blocks, or that unfinished part of?
Oh, you can't miss them. If you look at the museum and just follow the columns up to the big cornice, you'll see these great unfinished blocks up there. And they're not even like nicely stacked. They were stacked in the way that they should be sculpted. But interestingly enough, most people never notice them, which just proves my point. We really don't look at buildings, you know.
Did you do any buildings on the Lower East Side in your book?
Oh yeah, in the book, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The book, interestingly enough, the book was laid out in London. And they wrote to me and they said, what are the neighborhoods, you know, in New York? And so, yeah, so the way they laid out the book is by neighborhood, starting at the bottom and going all the way up to Harlem.
And you just focus on Manhattan?
Yeah. Here's the funny thing. When I started the blog 6 years ago, I said to myself, I'll work on Manhattan for about a year, maybe a year and a half, until I run out. And now I know that I will never, ever run out. I won't live that long. It's just absolutely impossible. There is so much in this town. And frankly, I barely touch anything past mid-century, you know, which is, I mean, I don't mean to snub, you know, anything past mid-century, but there's just so much stuff. It's incredible. I was having dinner with an architect friend maybe 6 or 7 months ago, you know, and I was saying, you know, people keep saying, well, when are you going to do Queens? When are you going to do Brooklyn? Brooklyn Heights is wonderful, which it is. And I always say, you know, I'm not going to run out. And he said the same thing. You'll never run out of Manhattan.
I have a friend whose friend who has a quote that everybody loves. It's, New York's going to be one of the places they ever finish.
Right.
Well, that seems like a good time in order.
Yeah. Thank you.
I see a lot of familiar faces, and if there's anybody new to the museum who doesn't know me, I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder and director of the Skyscraper Museum and curator for our exhibitions. And I have to say, apropos to tonight, I'm also from Ohio, Buckeye. So raise your hand if you're from Ohio. Yeah, okay, well, there are only 4 of us here. Yes. But there must be some kind of association of Ohio and aspirational New Yorkers, I think, that's playing out. I'll introduce Tom Miller in a moment, but I think that you all know, and you're probably on our newsletter, that we have a series of talks monthly, and as it happens in these next months, they're all guidebooks to New York. We thought it'd be fun. There seem to be a lot coming out, and they're enormously popular. They sell really well in our bookstore. In fact, it turns out we've sold a good deal of the books that we ordered for tonight, so if you want an autographed one, I think we only have 9 or 10 of those available tonight. So our book for tonight, Seeking New York by Tom Miller, is the first in our series of guidebook talks. And next month, Jake Raj and Francis Maroney will talk about their book. This is the old edition because there's a new cover for the new edition. I think it's the same text, but anyway, an updated cover. Actually, at the end of this month, Andrew Dolkart, in this book, which is kind of a guidebook to the landmarks of New York saving place that goes with the exhibition that's currently at the Museum of the City of New York to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Landmarks Law. And Andrew Dolkart, who is a renowned historian for sure, but one of the most loved tour guides for New York walking tours, will be talking in particular about the skyscraper is above Grand Central. Well, Grand Central is the landmark, and the Breuer plants that are in the Museum of City of New York exhibition right now with the gigantic megalithic office towers that were designed by Breuer before the Architects Collaborative project that is the Pan Am building and the MetLife building. So that'll be a kind of interesting drill down into the subject of New York landmarks. So it's kind of fun that we're able to do a kind of comparison shopping of different takes on the sidewalks of New York, the towers of New York, people who love New York, who spend an enormous amount of time digging into the history of New York, and in some cases come from somewhere else, because Tom Miller, if you know his blog and website, A Daytonian in Manhattan, is that
Right.
that's the correct title for it? You may be here tonight because you've encountered, as I have, his research into sometimes arcane topics, but always, enormously interesting histories that then he elaborates in text, but also embroiders, I guess, in pictures that give such a wonderful sense of richness and texture to the city. And that's what this book does too. In the number of entries, which is how many?
There's about 53, I think.
The only 50 is the history of New York, and only 50 buildings. To zoom in on these buildings, and tonight he has fashioned one that seems most appropriate to the Skyscraper Museum. But if you haven't seen the book, I strongly recommend that you take a look through it, buy it, and then use it as you perambulate New York. So, Tom, shall I just let you begin talking?
Sure.
There you go.
Good evening.